G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. In just the last few hours, Nikon has dropped not one, but two, what some are calling major firmware updates for not just the Z8, but also the Z6III. These updates are full of mostly video changes, video updates. There are some minor tweaks to the stills side of things, and with the Z6III, there is a rather large array of bug fixes, which of course makes sense as this camera is around about 6 months old, and of course there's always things to iron out. These days our cameras are probably more computers than they are anything else. And of course when it comes to any camera system, we do want them to be as bug-free as possible. Let's talk about the firmware components that these two cameras have in common with these firmware updates. Now, they are firmware 2.1 and firmware 1.1 for the Z8 and the Z6III, respectively. Now, of course, the Z9 around about 6 months ago or so had a major update in firmware 5.1. This bringing features for the brand new and recently announced 28 to 135 f4 power zoom, along with updates to shutter angle, which had been long awaited for the filmmakers amongst our cohort of Nikon Z users, along with changes to the histogram, customization and size of display and movement on the screen. Also includes the changes to waveforms and the changes to zebras found in the Z9 update. Both of these cameras have those updates in common. If you use the Z6III or the Z8 for video, many if not all of these features are warmly received. And if you check out my recent launch video for the power zoom, I did speculate that hopefully this was going to happen for the Z8 and the Z6III, especially when it came to the power high-res zoom collaboration. What this does, and I just think this is brilliant when it comes to these powerful cameras in the Z9, the Z8 and the Z6III, it allows you to use the sensor and the PZ combination not only for an optical zoom, but also for a digital zoom. In the case of the Z8 and the firmware upgrade that we're getting here today, it can now not only do the 28 to 135, but there is now an extra 2 times in digital, meaning that that lens can go out to 270 millimeters field of view equivalent when shooting 4K video. When it comes to the Z6III, its sensor is not as large. It is not a 45 megapixel sensor. It is a 24 megapixel sensor, and that allows us to get up to a 1.4 times digital zoom. Now, that's on top of the 135 millimeters at the long end or the 28 millimeters at the wide end and anywhere in between, but it does extend your lens. And thus, on the long end, the new power zoom on a Z6III will be able to go out to 189 millimeters field of view equivalent when shooting in 4K. Again, this is just a great combination. If you want a fantastic, affordable production camera like the Z6III, which can shoot RAW up to 60 frames per second, along with ProRes RAW, and you have this single zoom that basically is allowing you to go from 28 millimeters all the way out to almost 200 millimeters, a lens which can stay fixed wide open at f4. This is fantastic, and it's great to see the power high-res zoom collaboration being added to these two other high-end Nikon cameras. Another big addition to the Z6III is under the category of other changes, so not necessarily considered a bug fix, is the reduced noise in dark areas of N-log videos. Now, this might be the flickering that some people have talked about, especially when you push the files a little bit harder. It's not something that I have seen when shooting in N-log, and thus for those that might have been affected by this obvious flickering or noise in inverted commas. It's absolutely fantastic that Nikon is listening to their users and attempting to address this. We will look at that in future videos. Below that, Nikon has fixed the following issues. What I'll do is I'll throw that up on screen rather than read it all out and you have to listen to me droning away for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I've not experienced any of those 10 or so issues that are highlighted here. So again, this is pretty use case specific, and it's absolutely fantastic to see that Nikon is addressing all of these things in firmware 1.1 for the Z6III. And we jump to the Z8, we're going to version 2.10, and they talk about here under controls, shooting modes now can be selected in photo and video mode individually. Note that shooting modes in all shooting banks A through D are set to P right after the firmware is updated. So essentially you can be in manual mode while shooting stills and maybe in P or A mode whilst in video, allowing two different styles of shooting, and you don't have to keep jumping between the two. This is something that actually impacted me, and I'm really happy to see this update. The Z8 has also had some minor fixes addressed, and the first one being an interesting one to me that who knows if I ever experienced it. The buffer capacity would sometimes decrease when using some CF Express Type B cards. That's now addressed. And beyond that, there are a few other bug fixes, which again, I will place on the screen here for you to take a look at. From my perspective, some people would have been expecting other things. It's really interesting. We've talked about firmware before, and I think we just don't realize how complicated it is to get firmware out, the level of error testing that's required. And clearly right now, Nikon has made a major move when it comes to the power zoom and how they are trying to get into that market with some very serious gear. And so they need to back that up and have more than just the Z9 being able to take full advantage of that lens. So to have the Z9, the Z8 and the Z6III all getting the very best out of the new 28 to 135 power zoom, well, that makes a lot of sense. Nikon will release that lens into the market. I believe it's in April, and of course they want as many users as possible being able to get the most functionality out of that lens. That makes sense to me. And if we look at what the Z8, the Z9, the Z6III does today outside of these firmware updates, of course they are extremely capable cameras. And of course, there are more features that some people are looking for. And that might, for example, be pixel shift in the Z9. I don't know whether that will ever come. And also, I've seen discussions already, where is the bird detect on the Z6III? Yes, indeed. Well, as someone noted back to them, bird detect is in the Z6III. It's just part of animal detect. Will it come to the Z6III? I don't know. It's a highly capable camera. It shoots RAW at 20 frames per second. It's got that great partially stacked sensor. To me, it does make sense as basically a more accessible version of, say, an A9 III. Clearly, it's not a global shutter, but also it's way, way more affordable than the A9 III. But what they both have in common is they're both fast. 20 frames per second would be considered fast. They both have sensors that work very well without a mechanical shutter, and they're both 24 megapixels. That's why I put them in a similar category. And thus, if people are happy with an A9 III for wildlife, birding, action scenarios, there is no reason why people wouldn't be happy with the Z6III. So will bird-specific detect come to the Z6III? I don't know. I don't know if Nikon feel the same way about it. From my perspective, there is market differentiation and separation between a Z8 and a Z6III, and of course that starts with the sensor, one being 45.7 and the other one being 24 megapixels. That in itself is a big differentiator. For those that are very excited about what has been added with these firmware updates, which is mostly related to video, but if you include bug fixes, then it's a bit of a mix of everything. Yes, fantastic. And for those that haven't got what maybe they were wanting or hoping for this time around, maybe it'll come soon, but I will repeat what I've said in the past, which is the camera that we walk out of the store with on the day that we buy it, that is the camera that we've bought. And if we've bought it on the hope of a future firmware upgrade, then from my perspective, that's a false economy. We are not promised by anybody of any firmware that will come in the future, and the cameras that we have today are highly specified. And from my perspective, as long as any bugs appear and they are addressed, then this is magnificent. And we've seen Nikon addressing bugs for cameras that are quite old and still putting firmware out to keep these cameras as relevant as possible for cameras that I think are nearing 10 years. That's pretty fantastic. If this firmware is not exactly what you want, write a comment below about it and maybe Nikon will take that on board. And if it is, congratulations. All right, everybody, this has just been a quick one to talk about these new firmware updates. We never know what other little minor tweaks might have gone on under the hood. I expect they're always streamlining and optimizing, and it's more than just this list that we see here. It's super exciting stuff to see firmware of this size and that Nikon continues to improve the value of our cameras and what they're capable of doing. At the end of the day, my Z8 and my Z6III can now do things that they didn't do before. They didn't do it when I purchased them. And that is bringing more value to me, and that can only be a good thing. All right, everybody, love to know your thoughts about these firmware updates in the comments below. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again, so please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.